My boss sneaked into my tent at midnight. I woke up to the slow, deliberate sound of my tent zipper sliding open. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The corporate retreat had drained all of us. Forced hikes, trust exercises, polite laughter around a dying campfire. My body was heavy with exhaustion. But that sound, it was careful. Intentional. I held my breath. A silhouette slipped inside, blocking the thin silver light of the moon. And then I caught the faint scent of her perfume. Jasmine and something warmer, richer. "James," she whispered. My heart slammed against my ribs. Mary, my boss. My impossibly composed, dangerously elegant, very much engaged boss. She knelt inside my tent, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders instead of its usual polished style. Even in the dark, I could make out the curve of her silhouette, the quiet confidence she carried without trying. But tonight, something was different. Her breathing was uneven. "Stay calm," she murmured, her voice barely steady. "I'll explain in the morning. Stay calm." It was midnight. We were alone. "If anyone saw her here, Mary," I whispered back, my throat dry. "What are you doing?" She glanced over her shoulder toward the trees outside. And that's when I realized she wasn't here for romance. She was afraid. Let me take you back 3 weeks before that night, before the retreat. Before everything changed, I had worked under Mary for almost 2 years, and in that time I had learned one very important rule about myself. Never let her notice you noticing her. It sounds simple. It wasn't. Mary was the kind of woman who commanded a room without raising her voice. She was the regional director of operations, the youngest person in company history to hold that title, and at 42, she wore that achievement the way she wore everything else, effortlessly, beautifully, without apology. When she walked through the office floor every morning, there was always this brief collective pause, not just from me, from everyone. But I was different, because I actually paid attention. I noticed the way she held her coffee mug with both hands during early morning briefings, like she needed the warmth more than the caffeine. I noticed how she pressed her lips together slightly when a client said something incorrect, but she was too professional to correct them immediately. I noticed the quiet exhale she released every Friday at 5 o'clock, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city below. Not with pride, but with something that looked almost like longing. She was extraordinary. And she was completely untouchable. Then came the announcement. One Thursday morning, 3 months before the retreat, she gathered the senior team in the glass conference room and introduced a man named Richard. Tall, silver-haired, polished in that particular way that money polishes people. He stood beside her with his hand resting lightly on her shoulder and smiled at the room like he had already won something. "I wanted you all to meet my fiancée," Mary said, and her voice was warm and professional, perfectly calibrated. But I was watching her hands. She was holding her pen too tightly. After the meeting, as the room buzzed with congratulations, I stayed at my desk and stared at my screen without reading a single word on it. I had no right to feel what I felt. I was 28, she was my boss, she was engaged. The math of this situation was brutally clear, so I did what I always did. I stayed quiet, I stayed useful, I stayed invisible. But then the small moments began. The first one was unremarkable, or at least it should have been. It was a Tuesday afternoon and I was in the break room, fixing the ancient office coffee machine that had jammed again. Mary walked in, took one look at me crouched on the floor surrounded by paper towels and frustration, and said, "Please tell me you actually know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, without looking up. "I'm pretending to fix it so someone else will eventually take over." There was a silence, and then she laughed, a real laugh. Not the polished professional smile she gave clients. This was softer, surprised, and completely unguarded. "That is genuinely the most honest thing anyone has said to me this week," she said, leaning against the counter. I looked up at her then, and for exactly 2 seconds we just looked at each other. Then she straightened, smoothed her blazer, and walked out with her coffee. I didn't move for a full minute after she left. The second moment came during a late Thursday briefing that ran well past 7. Everyone else had filtered out, and I was packing up my notes when Mary glanced over from across the table and said quietly, "Do you ever feel like you're the only person in a room who actually sees what's happening?" I paused. "Every single day," I said honestly. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not professional warmth, something closer to recognition. "Good night, James," she said softly. I drove home that night with the windows down and my thoughts completely unraveling, because that's the thing about a secret crush. It doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, outline by outline, the way a portrait takes shape, one careful detail at a time. And by the time you see the whole picture, it's already too late to look away. The retreat was supposed to last 4 days. 4 days of team-building exercises, leadership workshops, and carefully scheduled bonding activities in the middle of a forest that smelled like pine resin and damp earth. The company had rented out an entire campsite 2 hours outside the city. Proper tents, wooden walkways, a central fire pit, and a lodge that served as our meeting space. I had packed professionally, neutral, practical. I had reminded myself firmly and repeatedly that this was work, that Mary was my boss. That Richard had dropped her off at the company van that morning with a proprietary hand at her waist and a kiss that she had accepted rather than returned. I told myself I hadn't noticed that detail. I absolutely had. By the end of day 1, something unexpected happened. The carefully constructed professional walls that held our office dynamic in place began to soften in the open air. Away from glass conference rooms and structured agendas, people became versions of themselves that the office never quite allowed, and Mary became someone I hadn't fully seen before. During the first team-building exercise, a navigation challenge where pairs had to find markers through the forest using only a compass and a hand-drawn map. Our team leader assigned us together. I watched Mary look down at the map with the same focused precision she brought to quarterly reports, and I made the mistake of smiling. "What?" she said, catching me immediately. Those sharp eyes missed nothing. "Nothing," I said. "You're holding that map like it owes you money." She looked at me for a beat. "And you're holding that compass like you've never seen one before." "I've absolutely seen one before," I said, turning it carefully. "In movies." She pressed her lips together hard, fighting the smile. "We are going to get completely lost, probably," I agreed, "but professionally lost." We did in fact get lost. For about 40 minutes, we found a creek that wasn't on the map, argued pleasantly about which direction north actually felt like, and eventually stumbled onto the correct marker entirely by accident. It was the most fun I had experienced in months. That evening around the campfire, the group dynamic loosened further. Someone produced a bottle of wine from their bag. The project managers started telling embarrassing office stories, and laughter moved around the circle like something warm and contagious. Mary sat across from me, her blazer replaced by a soft burgundy sweater, her hair down, her shoes traded for boots that were clearly newer than mine. In the firelight, she looked different, not less powerful, just more human, more present. At one point, someone made a joke about leadership styles, and several eyes turned to her with that familiar mixture of respect and slight nervousness. But Mary just tilted her head thoughtfully and said, "I think good leadership is mostly just paying attention to people before they have to ask you to." The group nodded appreciatively. But she was looking at me when she said it. I looked away first. Later, when the fire had burned lower and most of the group had drifted toward their tents, Mary and I ended up sitting beside each other in a natural, unplanned way that I didn't fully register until it had already happened. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice low enough that it was only for me. "I'm always quiet," I said. "No," she said, and she said it with such quiet certainty that it stopped me. "You're observant. There's a difference. Quiet people disappear. You don't disappear." I stared at the last red embers of the fire. My chest felt like something inside it was slowly, carefully being rearranged. "Mary," I started. "Good night, James," she said gently, and she stood, pulling her sweater close against the night air. I watched her walk toward her tent, and I knew with absolute clarity that I was in serious trouble, but I had no idea how serious it was actually about to become. I didn't sleep after she left. I lay on top of my sleeping bag and stared at the dark canvas ceiling of my tent, listening to the forest settle around me, the distant creak of branches, the low murmur of wind moving through the tree line, the occasional rustle of something small in the undergrowth. The campsite had gone completely quiet. Everyone was asleep. Everyone except me and apparently except Mary, because at exactly 12 minutes past midnight I heard it, that slow, deliberate sound of my tent zipper being pulled from the outside. Careful, measured. The way someone moves when they desperately don't want to be heard. I sat up, she slipped inside, and the first thing I registered was her breathing. It was controlled, but barely, the kind of breathing that comes from someone who has been managing themselves through something frightening for long enough that the effort is beginning to show. James. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried weight. Mary. I kept my own voice low, matching her register instinctively. What's happening? She sat down on the edge of the tent floor, drawing her knees slightly inward, and for a long moment she said nothing. Just looked at her own hands in the dark. This was not the woman who commanded boardrooms. This was not the woman who held her pen too tightly while announcing her engagement and smiled at the right moment with the right warmth. This was someone stripped of every professional layer, sitting in a stranger's tent at midnight because she had run out of places that felt safe. I found something, she finally said. I waited. On Richard's laptop. She paused, and I could see the muscle in her jaw tighten. He left it open this morning before we drove out here. I wasn't looking. I was just walking past. But the email was open on the screen and She stopped. What did it say? I asked carefully. She looked up at me then, and in the thin silver light that filtered through the tent fabric, I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen there before. Not sadness exactly. Something older and quieter than sadness. He's been communicating with someone on the board, she said. Someone who has been building a case against me. Expense reports that don't match. Project decisions reframed to look like negligence. Her voice remained even, but her hands, those hands I had learned to read without meaning to, were pressed flat against her knees, holding still by force. Someone has been feeding them information from the inside, and the timeline in that email. She exhaled slowly. It started 2 months after he proposed. The silence between us was dense and careful. He proposed so he could get close enough, I said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I ran my hand across my face, trying to organize my thoughts into something useful. Have you told anyone? Who would I tell, she said. And the simplicity of that question landed like something heavy. The board is already being influenced. HR reports to the same structure. And if I say anything without proof, without something concrete, I look paranoid. I look unstable. She almost laughed, but it came out wrong. It's actually a very clean trap. Then we get proof, I said. She looked at me. We? I met her eyes steadily. You came to my tent, Mary. You didn't go to anyone else's. Something moved across her face. Something she quickly pulled back into composure. But I saw it. A flicker of something raw and grateful and frightened all at once. I don't know why I came here, she admitted, barely above a whisper. But I did, and that terrified me more than any of the rest of it. Because whatever line existed between us, professional, appropriate, safe, we were no longer standing anywhere near it, and neither of us moved to go back. Morning arrived the way trouble always does. Quietly at first, and then all at once. I had fallen asleep sometime around 3, sitting upright against my tent pole, with Mary a careful, respectable distance away. Her breathing finally steadied into something resembling rest. When I opened my eyes, pale gray light was pressing through the tent fabric, and she was already gone. Only the faint trace of jasmine in the air confirmed that the night had actually happened. I dressed quickly and stepped outside. The campsite was waking up slowly. The smell of camp coffee drifted from the lodge. A few colleagues moved between tents, bleary and unhurried. Normal. Everything looked completely, deceptively normal. And then I saw the car. A black sedan parked at the edge of the gravel lot, still carrying the quiet authority of a long highway drive. And leaning against it, in a charcoal overcoat that was entirely wrong for a forest campsite, was Richard. He was already watching me. I kept my expression neutral and walked toward the coffee station, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. I poured a cup I didn't intend to drink and took in the scene with the peripheral awareness I had spent 2 years quietly developing. Richard wasn't here for a surprise romantic visit. He was standing too still for that. His eyes moved across the campsite with a kind of inventory, counting, assessing, cataloging. He was looking for something, or someone. Mary emerged from the lodge 20 minutes later, composed and immaculate in a way that suggested she had slept perfectly and felt nothing. She was extraordinary at that, assembling herself into exactly what the moment required. But I caught the half-second hesitation when she saw Richard's car. The way her step adjusted almost imperceptibly. I saw it because I was always watching. Richard crossed to her immediately, and from where I stood, I could read the body language clearly. His posture was not the posture of a man who had driven 2 hours to surprise his fiancée romantically. It was something closer to surveillance. By mid-morning, the atmospheres had shifted in a way most people couldn't name but everyone could feel. During the leadership workshop session in the lodge, our department head, a careful and politically cautious man named Gerald, pulled Mary aside before the group assembled. Their conversation was brief and quiet, conducted near the back window with lowered voices and tightened expressions. When Mary returned to the table, her face was professionally serene. Her pen was clicking. Once, twice, 3 times, the tell I had never told anyone I knew. After the session broke for lunch, a colleague named Sandra, efficient, well-connected, and the kind of person who always seemed to know things slightly before they became official, leaned toward me with her lunch tray and said quietly, "Apparently someone submitted an anonymous complaint to corporate. Something about expense irregularities on the Hartwell account, very specifically about Mary." I said nothing. I kept eating. "Terrible timing," Sandra continued, watching the room. "Middle of a retreat. Very public, very deliberate," I said. Before I could stop myself, Sandra looked at me with mild surprise, then something more evaluative. She said simply, and moved away by afternoon. Richard had positioned himself at the edges of every group activity, with the patient ease of someone who had planned to be exactly where he was. During the outdoor strategy exercise, he inserted himself smoothly into conversations, laughing at the right moments, charming the right people, particularly those with influence. I watched him work the room the way I had once watched Mary command one. But where Mary led with substance, Richard operated with surface. Gloss. Calculated warmth. At one point, across the clearing, Mary caught my eye. It lasted only a second. But in that second, everything was communicated. The weight of what we both knew, the danger of the situation, and something else beneath it that neither of us had named yet. I looked away first, but this time it cost me something to do it. By the 3rd evening, the retreat had become 2 entirely different experiences happening simultaneously. On the surface, it was exactly what the company had intended: structured activities, professional development, team cohesion. People were laughing around the fire again, sharing meals, photographing the sunset through the trees with their phones held up like small rectangular offerings to the sky. Underneath all of that, something was fracturing. I had spent the afternoon carefully and quietly doing what I did best: observing. While everyone else participated in the final group workshop, I had noticed Richard step away from the lodge twice, both times moving toward the far edge of the campsite where the signal was marginally stronger. Both times, his call was short, and both times he returned wearing the expression of someone who had just confirmed a plan rather than made a casual conversation. I noted the times. I noted the direction he faced while speaking. I noted everything. After dinner, I found a moment to approach Mary near the water station at the side of the lodge, positioning myself so that our conversation looked like nothing more than 2 colleagues refilling their cups. "Tonight," I said quietly, not looking at her directly. "We need to talk properly, James," she began, her voice carrying that familiar note of professional caution. "Not about us," I said. "About the emails, about what you saw, and about the 2 phone calls he made this afternoon from the north side of the campsite." A pause. "You were watching him." "I watch everyone," I said simply. "It's just that today it mattered." She was quiet for a moment, and then, so briefly that someone less attentive would have missed it entirely. The corner of her mouth lifted. Not quite a smile. Something more private than that. "You're surprisingly useful for someone who fixed a coffee machine with paper towels," she said. "I prefer the term resourceful," I said. "Of course you do," she replied softly, and walked away before either of us could say anything that carried more weight than the moment could safely hold. That night, she came to my tent again, this time without the urgency of fear, this time with the quiet deliberateness of choice. She sat across from me in the narrow space, close enough that I was acutely aware of every small movement, and she told me everything. The full timeline. The way Richard had inserted himself into her professional life before the engagement, asking careful questions she had interpreted as interest and investment. The subtle way financial documentation had begun to shift over the past several months. Small discrepancies, easily missed, but accumulated into a pattern that was now being presented to the board as negligence at best and misconduct at worst. "I built everything I have," she said, and her voice was steady but thin at the edges, like fine material pulled too tight. "Every position, every result, every relationship in that company. I built it without shortcuts and without favors, and without anyone handing me anything." She looked at her hands, and he sat across from me at dinner and told me he admired that. And I believed him. The silence after that was the kind that asks not to be filled too quickly. "You're allowed to have believed him," I said finally. "That's not weakness, that's just being human." She looked at me then, and the professional composure she wore like a second skin slipped. Just slightly, just enough. Her eyes held something unguarded and exhausted and quietly desperate. "Why does it feel like weakness?" she whispered. I wanted to reach across the space between us. I kept my hands where they were. "Because you're used to being the person who sees everything coming," I said quietly, "and this time you didn't. And that's frightening for someone like you." She held my gaze for a long moment. "Someone like me," she repeated softly, as if she was turning the phrase over, examining what I meant by it. "Remarkable," I said. Simply, directly, the word landed between us and stayed there. Her breath shifted almost imperceptibly. She looked away toward the tent wall, and when she looked back, something had changed in her expression. Something had been decided. "James," she said quietly, "whatever happens tomorrow, whatever this costs you, I need you to know that I see you. I have seen you for a long time." My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I know," I said softly. "I've been waiting for you to say it." Outside, the forest was completely still, and inside that small tent, something that had been quietly building for 2 years, finally, carefully, stepped into the open. Morning came differently on the 4th day. It arrived with clarity, the sharp, clean kind that follows a night when something important has finally been decided. I was already dressed when the sound of raised voices drifted across the campsite from the direction of the lodge. Not angry exactly, formal, the kind of voices that belong to people who have rehearsed what they intend to say. I walked toward it without hurrying. The lodge held a small, tense gathering. Gerald, 2 people I recognized from the corporate compliance team, who had arrived that morning in the same kind of car Richard drove, and Richard himself, standing near the window with the composed confidence of someone who believed the next few minutes belonged to him. Mary stood at the center of it, alone, perfectly still. I stepped inside. Richard's eyes moved to me briefly, assessed me as irrelevant, and returned to Gerald. That was his first mistake, his only significant one, as it turned out. "James," Mary said, and her voice was calm and clear. "You don't have to be here." "I know," I said, and took a position beside her. What followed was what Richard had clearly engineered carefully, the presentation of a documented case. Expense reports with highlighted discrepancies, project records reframed with selective context, an anonymous testimony that was structured with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who knows exactly what they are building. It was, as Mary had said, a very clean trap. Except that traps only work when no one has been watching the person who built them. I placed my phone on the table. On the screen were photographs, Stramters, call directions, and a series of screenshots I had quietly captured over the previous 48 hours, including a reflection in the lodge window that clearly showed Richard photographing internal documents from Mary's work folder during the second morning session, while she presented at the front of the room. "He photographed those documents himself," I said quietly, then submitted them anonymously after selectively removing context. The timestamp on that photograph predates the complaint filing by 6 hours. The room went very still. Gerald looked at the screen for a long time. The compliance representatives exchanged a look that carried significant professional weight. Richard's composed expression did not collapse dramatically. Men like him rarely allowed that. But something behind his eyes went flat and careful, in the way of someone rapidly recalculating. "This will need to be reviewed thoroughly," Gerald said finally. and the temperature of those words made their direction unmistakable. Richard left the lodge with the quiet efficiency of a plan that had failed. He did not look at Mary on his way out. She didn't watch him go. When the room had emptied and only the two of us remained, Mary stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the tree line where the morning light was moving slowly through the branches. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," I agreed. "It could have affected your position." "It could have," I said. She turned from the window and looked at me with an expression I had never seen directed at me before and will likely spend a long time trying to adequately describe. Gratitude, yes, but beneath it something warmer and more permanent. "Why? James?" she asked softly. I held her gaze. You already know why. Her eyes held mine for a long, still moment. And then, for the first time in 2 years of careful distance and professional composure and deliberately quiet admiration, she crossed the space between us. She didn't say anything. She simply took my hand in both of hers and held it. That was enough. That was everything, 6 months later. The office feels different now, or perhaps I simply move through it differently. Mary leads her team with the same precision and elegance she always has, but the pen no longer clicks during difficult meetings. The hands are steady. We take our coffee together every morning quietly before the floor fills. No announcements, no performance. Just two people who found each other in a forest at midnight and decided slowly and honestly that it was worth every complicated, beautiful thing that came next. Some mornings she looks at me across the table and says nothing, but she smiles the real one, and I still don't look away first.